We'll start now the questions and answer session. We'll start now the questions and answer session.
Thanks very much.
Very good.
Thank you.
As usual, we offered some conversation starters to the members, and they're on the screen. I'm going to invite questions from the tables, and there are mics, as you're aware, around the room. So hands up if you want to put a question.
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator for Table 8. The citizens at this table have requested a question for Dr. O'Mahony. How do you think that the 8th Amendment benefits and protects the pregnant mother and the expectant father?
Well, I think it protects them in the way that it protects everybody's rights, and that is part of the challenge of the 8th Amendment, is that the rights of the unborn, the mother and the father, need to be taken into account. So that I think in that way it's the general approach to it, emphasizing the rights of both mothers and the unborn, is a way of helping to protect everybody, but then also doesn't, it leaves the challenges of then having to work through the practical details to other avenues.
Thank you very much. Another question?
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator for Table 14, and the table had a point of feedback rather than a question. It was felt at the table that the talks on ethics was a little restrictive in terms of it didn't really address the 8th Amendment as well as ethics. So it was felt at the table that the talks didn't really deliver thoughts on the 8th Amendment in its entire scope outside of just abortion. So limits on the woman's autonomy in more general terms.
Very good. Just before, would either of you like to comment on that? I have to be honest, I think you did the task that was given to you, both of you, but would you like to say anything about that?
I did focus on the issue of abortion, but of course, not of course, but I believe that the 8th Amendment has serious health and risk implications for women who continue with their pregnancy, because, as we know, with some of the cases that have already happened, the pregnant woman who's choosing to continue and wants to continue with her pregnancy is at the same time at risk because of the emphasis that health professionals have to place or are required to place on the equal status of the fetus. So yes, I think there are serious concerns about the implications of the 8th Amendment for women.
Yeah. Donald?
Yeah, I would accept that critique as well, and that our focus was to be on the kind of the ethical principle of autonomy as it relates to this issue, and I think that's where the 8th Amendment does emphasize the protection of the unborn as well as the woman involved. And yet then if you're to move beyond that to something else, that the importance of evaluating how autonomy is going to be interpreted or applied or presented there is really the big challenge that would be there to ensure that all involved are going to be protected equally.
Yes, I just make two observations. The first is that you have to assess what you heard today in conjunction with what you heard last week, which concerned the moral status of the unborn, of the fetus. And so you look at the whole picture. The other point I would make is that we will probably have some legal commentary at the next meeting about whether the unborn, as a matter of law, has other rights besides the right to life. And I don't know whether that was in the mind of the table. Yes?
Hi, thanks. Just to kind of maybe clarify a little bit further, because to be clear, what we were looking at was more how the Eighth Amendment impacts on a woman's choices in maternity care. So around access to C-sections or access to different types of maternity care, and we felt that wasn't clearly addressed. We felt that the focus had been very much on abortion as opposed to the full scope, and that was what we were looking for.
That's going to be a subject of another paper. Thank you very much. And I misunderstood what you were saying. Any other questions?
I'm the facilitator for Table 3, and the table has 2 questions for Thionól. In your paper, and also when you spoke, you referred to the good life. How do you quantify a good life? What components do you think go into it? Is there an element of socioeconomics and also being wanted? The second question for Thionól also is, you said there's a need for forgiveness. You said our society should be one that supports and encourages and forgives people as they make hard choices. In what context do you mean this? And can you explain a bit more what you mean about forgiveness? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. By the good life, I think this is really our broad vision for what we think are the important values that we formulate our life upon, our society upon, and then the types of goals that we put into life. I think if you take an extreme where if the good life means that we need to have a certain amount of income and certain size of house and a very material type of focus, then that is going to create certain values and things that people will really emphasize and push towards. And then I think our legal and ethical frameworks will push towards that. So it's really kind of then in contrast, if we have a good life which is about the equal development and opportunities for all involved, where it's about protection of the weakest, putting structures into place, legal and practical, that are going to really help those who are the weakest be raised up to their full potential, then that implies a whole other set of values, and some of those then are what I was trying to articulate around the way autonomy fits in with other principles to get balance there. So that's what I had in mind with that. And then by forgiveness, I really mean the idea that we are all not going to live up to the ideals that maybe our view of the good life or our legal structures will put into place, and that people will make mistakes, and that there should be a way that we can acknowledge that where we can kind of give people the opportunity to make up for that, to not be labeled or branded in some way that because you've made a mistake in some way that you're going to be rejected or discriminated against. And so it's having that culture of acknowledging that even if whatever the ideal is, that we need to be willing with one another to accept that we're not all going to be able to adhere to that all the time. And rather than writing off people, that we have a mechanism by which we acknowledge that things have happened that are less than ideal, that we accept the person without at the same time saying, therefore, we need to assume that the less than ideal is what just is accepted as the norm, that we still hold on to those ideals and really continue to support and help those who have made mistakes, who have taken other paths, and help them in the ways that they're trying to get back on track with life.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yeah.
And I'm the facilitator for Table 1. This table was unanimous in asking that both speakers be commended for their presentations, which this table felt were very, very easy to follow. And this table also the unanimous comment that in fact there was a great deal that can be reconciled between them, and they felt that they only diverged at the end. I have one specific question for Dr. O'Mahuna from this table, and it arises from this in your presentation, where you said, autonomy is a means to an end. It does not tell us what ends are ethical. Relational autonomy goes beyond the right to choose. It includes the responsibility to choose the right thing. The question that this table wanted to ask, and that is, who decides what the right thing is, and is this autonomy?
Thank you, and thank you for your first comments, which I think Joan and I would agree between ourselves as well, that we do have a lot in common. With your question, I think my concern there is that a lot of times the way this self-rule autonomy is taken is that freedom of choice kind of settles the issue that if the individual is able to make the choice, that's the end of the sort of the external input. Whereas my point about autonomy being an end is that when somebody does have the freedom to choose, whether it's in just an ordinary medical situation and patients have the right to decide what procedures they undergo or what treatments they get, that there is a whole other host of ethical aspects that have to be taken into consideration, and that the person needs to weigh up other things like the benefits and the harms that are involved, issues of justice and many other ethical aspects, rather than the focus being primarily on who is the one who gets to make that decision. And then in terms of, well, how do we decide what those right things are? How do we know what that broader vision is? I think that's where there are going to be differences of opinion, and that's where this broader view of the good life, this broader view of what are the values that we want to build our society on are going to come from. That yes, there will be differences of opinion, but that as in any area as we build up our society, that we're going to have laws, we're going to have codes of ethics in different professions and different bodies, and that it's out of those and out of the discussions that go into those that we're going to decide on what that broader framework is of what the right decisions actually are going to be based upon.
Very good, thank you. And there's one question to be addressed to both the panel. Does the panel know of anything which would be an equivalent restriction on the autonomy of men? Because obviously the restriction on reproductive autonomy is one that applies to women only.
I'm tempted to think common decency, but I think that in an ideal world, and in many relationships where there is an unplanned pregnancy, it is really important that the people around the pregnant woman are supporting her, are thinking about her, are involved in advising her. In terms of responsibilities, it's obviously difficult to compel men to assume responsibilities in relation to it. So, yeah, that's the best I can do with that one.
Yeah, I would say that certainly it's not equivalent in terms of the man does not biologically have to deal with the same situations. But I think this is where if you look on autonomy much more as not just the right to decide, but the right to, or the responsibility to make good choices. If you look at any relationship, any set of relationships, I believe the father and the mother of the unborn have got responsibilities that will put restrictions on their own autonomy towards caring and helping the unborn to develop. that just as for a successful marriage, there will need to be choices made in order for each partner to decide to put the relationship at a higher priority than what their own individual choices might lead them towards. So in a much broader way, I think there are responsibilities to put relationships before the individual choices that apply more generally.
Very good, thank you both.
Thank you.
The facilitator for Table 2. The citizens of this table would like to direct a question unanimously to Dr. O'Mahuna. They note that your analogies seem more suited to an idealistic world and may not reflect the reality for most women. You suggested that we need to use autonomy to protect the weakest and most vulnerable in society. Do you not consider that women in a crisis pregnancy are also in a weak and a vulnerable situation, and that we should use our autonomy to protect those weak and vulnerable people? Thank you.
I can accept that some of what I was saying was idealistic, and I think that is where we kind of build our overall ethical framework in terms of the direction we want to move in. And that's part of why introducing the idea of forgiveness at the end there was to acknowledge that that isn't always going to be what will work out practically speaking. But I would agree completely that the woman who's in a crisis pregnancy is in a very vulnerable situation. That whether, no matter how the crisis pregnancy has developed, that there are situations there that are going to be very difficult and challenging and create all sorts of challenges. But that is an additional level of complexity and challenge to the situation that if the approach is to favor the one who has a bit more power and always privilege their autonomy, in that case to privilege the woman over the unborn, that is not setting up a good framework to work towards ways that we actually promote the good of those who are in vulnerable situations, so that vulnerability needs to be taken into account in all of the ways, and that the woman, just like the unborn, needs to be taken care of and given the proper supports, bringing in those either from within the immediate relationships that are involved there, and then the broader societal supports in order to help everybody who's weak to be supported through that crisis.
Any other questions?
How are we doing? Dave, Assembly Member on Table 4. The question will be to Dr. O'Mahuna, but for Dr. McCarthy as well. In my understanding, the autonomy of the woman is partially removed as Article 43.3 stands at the moment, because there's equal right of life to the unborn. So there's not full autonomy for the woman to make a choice. And in your presentation, you had said that one of the goals for an alternative to termination would be that services, supports and all that existed for women who have pregnancies, that the option is there that they can continue with the pregnancy, have the child, and afterwards a solution or a safe environment can be provided for the child. Now, as you said yourself, that's, as it stands now, that's a relatively idealistic society. It doesn't exist. There's very few countries where it's, it's 100% that everything's great. In saying that, with the legislation or with the law as it stands now, that there isn't abortion on demand, or that there's only exceptional circumstances that abortion is available in this country, do you feel that if those idealistic realities of services and supports for pregnant women and for post-birth children and that, if they existed now in this country as it stands now, even with the laws as they are, do you believe that that would have a huge effect, a small effect, or no effect on the fact that there's 3,000 women travelling to England to have abortions now, as it stands, being in the case of, is there still an underlying moral or ethical reason why these journeys are happening? Or could it be put down to just that there is no sufficient services of support for the woman?
Yes. Donal, you go first, and then Joan can have a...
I think services and support are one part of the larger fabric of society. I think there are huge numbers of reasons as to why women become pregnant when they don't want to be or they didn't intend to be. And so services and support are not going to address many of those broader frameworks as to why that situation comes about. And that gets into the whole set of values around sexual activity and the formation of relationships and the structures that are there within society more generally, and the types of values that get promoted. So I think it's a much bigger issue that services and support on their own are not going to be able to resolve all of those sorts of issues. There's all sorts of things about parenting and families and education and that sort of way of leading us to understand why we develop the values that we have and the behaviors that we do. But that the supports that would be needed, and I suppose this is where once an unwanted pregnancy develops, that then if there are no supports and values or supports and services, then it is going to make that option of looking for a termination as more attractive or more the only way out of this situation. So that by introducing those, that we can have a better sense of choosing that option than simply leaving it that, well, you're on your own to sort things out. But that a lot of the support that is needed is not going to come through services. It's going to come back on the people immediately involved in the situation and their relationships. And that's why I wanted I added at the end that it's going to involve the unplanned grandparenthood and others around coming together to support people. If there is an issue of forgiveness there, if that goes against the family values of those families, of seeing that it is more important to promote the life that is there now, rather than taking some other path that is going to make the trip abroad more attractive.
Joan, would you like to make an observation?
I think it's fair to say that abortion has always been with us from the beginning of time, and abortion will always be with us. And what isn't there in Donal's very, I suppose, sympathetic pictures of the pregnant woman and the family is the crisis pregnancy, is the coercive sex and so on, is not the incidents that qualify for forgiveness, which is a word I would be very suspect about in terms of the requirement of forgiving anybody for unplanned pregnancies. And I think in terms of autonomy, if I want to be quite as clear as I can be about what I think is the difference between myself and Donal about autonomy, is that my autonomy is also concerned about other dependents and other families and communities, of course. But my deep concern is that in this room, we have moral disagreement about this issue. We disagree about what's important. And my view of autonomy in a pluralistic liberal democracy such as we live in, or aspire to live in, is that we create the widest possible expression of that autonomy, and that we hold on to what I consider our core human rights, to defend each other's rights, to do as we think best. So the difference between myself and Donal's position really is that in Donal's view of the good life, which isn't entirely clear to me what that is, would require me to live according to his version of the good life, Whereas my version of the good life, on a pluralist view, is that Donal is free to live as he wishes, to espouse the values he wishes, etc., and I am too. So my understanding of autonomy is to leave room for these differences of opinion and not to compel each other to live to some perfect formula of how it is to live the good life.
Good.
Sorry.
I'll just take one more question. Have we? Oh, we have until 11:30.
Okay. It's just a couple of points of feedback from the table for the Secretariat.
Yes.
This is from Table 4, and I'm the facilitator. The citizens at the table found that there was a lack of clarity which side of the issue certain advocacy groups came down on, and it made the decision with regard to making a recommendation as to which groups were to come in a little difficult. So they just felt that it would be important to bring that to your attention. And then the second point is there was some concern that advocacy groups presenting to the Assembly, that we have had some very high quality and balanced presentations from both sides over the last few weeks. And the concern was that partisan and emotive presentations from either pro-life or pro-choice groups could undo the good work of the Assembly if those presentations are made in the final weekend before we make our recommendations to the Oireachtas.
Well, I think the plan is that they will we'll have them at the next weekend, not the final weekend, next weekend.
And just on the point about lacking clarity, I suppose the purpose of us sending you a list and publishing them in advance was to give you an opportunity to read them, and so it's not obvious necessarily from the title, but the idea is that having read them, you then decide, okay, that's somebody who I want to hear from. So,
yes, very good. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm a member from Table 12, and this is in the context of information that was given at a previous assembly, where it was reported that there were approximately 1,500 abortion pills sourced over the internet. Now, so the question is, we are a society where 1,500 abortion pills were delivered over the internet in a 1 or a 2 year period. Do we have an ethical responsibility as a society to address this phenomenon in our laws, particularly as these numbers are likely to increase? Now, we asked a similar question to the medical, to the Rape Crisis Centre yesterday, but from an ethical viewpoint, we'd be particularly interested in hearing both your views on this.
Joan?
I think it's worth remembering that something like 90% of abortions happen before 12 weeks gestation. And that indicates that pregnant women are very concerned not to be pregnant and will not be pregnant as early as possible, will stop the pregnancy as early as possible. And the medical pathway seems to be a good, safe solution to do that, and is probably responsible for the lower travel rates to the UK and elsewhere. I think we have an ethical responsibility to provide proper care, proper prescribing, proper aftercare for the women who take that route.
Donald, yes.
Yeah, I would agree that there is an ethical responsibility to look at that issue, because even if these pills are being taken in the first few weeks of pregnancy, that is still not an easy decision for a woman to make, or her situation that has led her into that is not going to be an easy one either. And that one of the challenges with internet provision of materials like this, or any sort of tablets, that the person is sort of on their own dealing with this whole situation, and that while the abortion pill is relatively safe in many ways, there are instances where severe bleeding can result from taking it. So it's not without risk, as no pharmaceutical is, and so I think there is an ethical responsibility on society to look at that, to see what are the reasons behind it, what's going on, and whether or not legislation or some other approach is the way to deal with that. And I would like to kind of respond to what Joan said about our differences, which I would agree that there is a difference between us in terms of how we kind of bottom line address these issues, and that I am in favor of people being free to make their choices in many ways, but that one of the purposes of our legal structure and our constitution is to say where are the bounds to some of those choices that we would make. And I would hold that in many ways we are free to make our choices, and that we can accept differences of opinion around many different issues. But on issues of life and death, on a behavior that is going to end the potential for somebody else to come into this life and enjoy it with its benefits and its challenges, that is one of those areas where autonomy should be limited in various ways, and that we should really examine this, that there are many areas like this. And so we may accept that, well, it's okay for you to buy your stuff from places where it's been manufactured in sweatshops, but there is an important way of having a social debate and saying, well, but some of those choices are less ethical or more ethical, and when you move into something like issues of life and death, you're into a whole other category where we really ought to put limits on some autonomous choices.
Just to follow up on that,
Yes,
if I
yes.
might. I agree in the sense of course, there are limitations to what any of us can do, and we have to be very careful to make sure that we have the best grounds on which we should draw those limits when we're interfering with deeply personal concerns. I suppose, from a pluralist point of view, the place I would go to is the Declaration on Human Rights, which talks about very fundamental rights that are needed, and that is based on a moral community and a moral consensus that, since the Second World War and before it, in fact, that allows us to engage in a reasonable and sincere way with each other, but that nevertheless protects some core human rights. And particularly, as we have found with cases in recent times in Ireland, women's rights.
Thank you very much. Yes.
The citizens of Table 5 have two questions for Dr. O'Mahoona. You spoke about the impact a decision can have on others, and one example you gave was friends. The question from the citizens is, how do you equate the impact a decision made during a crisis pregnancy has on the woman concerned in comparison to her friends? The second question, you suggested that intimate relations should not be engaged in until a committed relationship that could welcome a child exists. How do you think that view represents the reality of our society? Are you ignoring the reality of people's imperfections, and is your position too simplistic?
Well, thank you. And on the question of friends, I think this is where that they may or may not come into the situation, and I think obviously the woman and the unborn are at the core of this and have a much deeper investment and are much more greatly impacted than friends might be. And yet at the same time, I know that for some people, their most intimate relationships are what we would call their friends. And so engaging with them in the challenging aspects of all that is involved, whether it's in thinking through the whole process, in dealing with the emotional aspects, or then in helping to support the woman as if she decides to keep the pregnancy. That in that way, the role of friendship is going to be very important as part of that supportive community around people as we go through life. I think the other aspect of the other question to do with sexual activity, Obviously, I live in the world that we're in. I know that the idea of keeping sexual activity to committed relationships is not the way that many people live their lives these days. And yet I think there are, what I was advocating or kind of trying to point out with that is that there are consequences to adopting that type of position, to engaging in that type of behavior. And that some of the challenge arises where we have convinced ourselves that sexual activity is something that should be independent of pregnancy and birth. There's just no way to avoid some percent of a chance of pregnancy. And so that is what I think is the more realistic view of the way the world is, that type of activity brings with it a certain chance of pregnancy, and that people should really be considering that before engaging in that sort of activity. I think it is certainly an ideal. It's not the way our world is at the moment, and yet I think if we want to be a world that is receptive to children and committed to really benefiting them as they come into the world, that we really need to look at that type of value and engage in that part of this whole larger issue as to why crisis pregnancies in some cases arise, or why unwanted pregnancies sometimes arise.
Yes.
Table 9. Does the current legal position in the 8th Amendment regarding the obligation for women to travel interfere with a woman's autonomy? And that's to both people in the panel. And a second question for both of you is, should the unborn child be granted autonomy in the same way as a woman on a kidney dialysis machine might? And then the third question is specifically to Joan McCarthy. What exactly do you mean by the unborn child is connected to the community, and does that confer equal rights on the unborn child?
Do you want to start?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, having to go to the UK obviously impacts on women's, not just their autonomy, but their health as well, because they are basically, in effect, compelled to continue a pregnancy that they feel is not the responsible or morally right thing to do for them, their fetus, their community, their husband, their children, the other concerns that they would have. It's not just an individual decision. It is a decision that has to take account of other people as well. So definitely the 8th Amendment in its prohibition on access that requires women to go to the UK. And this is especially, as I said in my paper, this is especially true for women who, for one reason or another, are unable to travel. And that is particularly difficult, that the state, in effect, forces them to continue with the pregnancy. That is dangerous, and so on. The second question, in terms of informed consent around ordinary, or we might say, for non-pregnant people, and a hidden dialysis machine and so on. I'm not sure what way to go about this, but I think, yes, it's going to impact differently on the pregnant woman, because she doesn't have the same rights to refuse treatment of the various kinds. This goes back to the earlier question about the impact of the 8th Amendment on women who choose to continue their pregnancy and then perhaps run into risky situations there that require medical interventions of one kind or another, and what their status is in relation to that. If it's that, then the 8th Amendment clearly, because it gives the fetus or the unborn equal rights, impacts on the woman's right to make decisions or to be involved even in decision making. That's that would be my view on that. In terms of the fetus, I suppose going back to the idea of relationship, I think that I would see the pregnant woman as in a relationship with the fetus in a very intimate way, biologically connected, and also the source of nurturing the fetus is dependent on her and so on for life. So the pregnant woman for me is somebody who, should she continue with the pregnancy, this is a social role she's undertaking, a burden, a gift for some perhaps, a burden for others, taking on physical, emotional, a life-changing event. And so in that sense, it's bringing human life into the community. And I'm not sure about the last piece of that question about the community. That her relationship with the community, if she chooses or if she feels that she must make the decision to terminate the pregnancy, I think she's also considering her community in that sense too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes,
yeah.
that answers it.
Well, I think on the first point about the right to travel, I think that yes, there is a restriction there on the woman's autonomy, that if she is not able to obtain something here, then she would have the requirement to go elsewhere to try to find that. And I think that is part of the challenge with all of the laws that we have, that they are going to put various restrictions on people's autonomy as they relate to that issue. And that's part of what this process is looking to see, is are those restrictions or limitations on someone's autonomy justified? And I think in terms of protecting the life of the unborn, that some of those types of consequences are acceptable in terms of the goal of protecting life. And then with the question about the kidney machine, I'm afraid I didn't quite understand how you were bringing that into this. Could you maybe clarify, or I don't know if Joan has addressed that satisfactorily already?
Could you hold on just 1 second?
Sorry, it was just in relation to whether the unborn could be granted rights in the same way as a mature woman who was on a dialysis machine is obviously granted rights, and her autonomy is affected by the fact that she's on a dialysis machine. There's certain things she can and cannot do as a result of her condition or illness. In the same way as an unborn child is dependent on the mother. Or not, the autonomy, possibly you could argue, of the unborn child is affected by that.
Well, I think certainly the autonomy of the unborn is certainly dependent on the woman, and in that way, there are going to be limitations to that. And this is again, I guess, where as a woman who's on a kidney dialysis machine, or anybody who's ill is going to have restrictions on their autonomy. They might like to do certain things or go places, and yet their illness or their requirement for treatment is going to limit that just through the way nature is. And yet I think where there is an important difference with the unborn is that if this is a choice that with the dependence that the unborn has on the woman, but that if the limitation on their autonomy is to the point of their life being ended, then that ends up being a matter of the deliberate choice of somebody, and that's a good bit different then as to why somebody ends up in a medical situation where their autonomy is restricted by the illness or the treatment, as opposed to a deliberate choice that someone would make to end that person's life. I'm not quite sure if I'm getting at your question.
Yeah. Has he answered the question?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind if Dr. McCarthy could answer, having made the comments that I did.
Yes, I think we have to be careful. It's good to be careful about how we use the term autonomy, because it becomes a bit meaningless in the sense of attributing it to a fetus. Because autonomy means, for me, or my understanding, and I think, well, obviously we disagree about that, but for me, it's the idea of having values and being able to express them and articulate them to determine your life according to them. I think you might talk about the fetus as having potential autonomy. If it's nurtured by the pregnant woman, if it is born, then it will eventually, many things can happen, of course. It may eventually grow into an adult and have autonomy then. But I don't think it has autonomy interests in pregnancy. It doesn't have autonomy as such. It has potential autonomy. And I think we need to protect the actual autonomy of the pregnant woman, not the potential autonomy of the fetus.
Very good. Thank you very much. We'll have one more. Yeah.
Hello, I'm the facilitator for table 10. This table has one question for Dr. O'Mahoona. The Assembly listened to detailed presentations on the complexities of rape and discussed this issue yesterday. Your presentation today raised one case in which a mother in that position continued with the pregnancy and the child was then happy to be alive. This table would like clarification on the following. Is it your position that another person's ethics should dictate that a woman in that position should continue with the pregnancy in every case?
I think with what we can do with ethics is we lay out a framework for making ethical decisions, and we're going to arrive at our views on what we hold to be the most ethical approach to things. But ethics is not going to be it's not going to have the same force of action as, say, something legal, where then you force somebody to act according to those values. I think a big part of what ethics and the moral life is about laying out a vision, about inviting people and encouraging people to live according to that, and also to have the examples of those that we can refer to and say, that person lives according to these ethical principles and values, and that shows me an attractive way of life that I want to follow and want to find out how to follow. So that's what I would hold as the value of ethics, what I mean in part by the good life, that it's not about forcing somebody to adhere to my ethical vision, but about encouraging and asking people to move towards that vision.
Thank you very much. I think we'll stop there, and I use the expression thought-provoking at the end of the talks, and the responses to the questions and answers are thought-provoking as well, and I think we should show our gratitude to both speakers. It's been very, very helpful. And we'll have our coffee break now, and we'll recommence at 11:45. But can I say one thing before you? Don't forget to complete the form in relation to the advocacy groups, please.
I have to go and